Hello, my name is Mark Worthing, and I would like to read to you the first chapter of a fantasy novella which is soon to be published called The Winter Fae. Floyd Eric Willis was 87 years, 4 months, and 13 days old the winter they came for him. The snow was falling heavily when his son John, daughter Susan, a doctor who was needed to sign the papers, and 2 ambulance officers in uniform arrived at Rocky Creek, the last farm before the Great Wood. Trouble was, Floyd wasn't there. In fact, many would say that Floyd had not been there for some years. Dementia, they called it. Floyd would have none of it, though. He remembered what he wanted to remember. There was nothing wrong with him. Things had been hard since Emily passed 8 years earlier, but he had no intention of going anywhere. He had been born at Rocky Creek, and he would die there. His great-grandparents had cleared the land up to the borders of the swamps and ravines of the Great Wood, and the family had been there ever since. Their Great Wood, of course, had fought back. It didn't like the encroachment of civilization. But now he was the last, the end of the line. His children and grandchildren had little interest in the farm. They hardly had time to visit these days. The farm would ultimately be reclaimed by the Great Wood, but as long as he still had breath in him, Floyd was determined that that time had not yet come. Oh, he did forget things. He knew that. To his way of thinking, that proved he did not have dementia. After all, someone with dementia wouldn't remember that there were things they had forgotten. His Aunt Sybil had had dementia. She couldn't remember her children, Floyd's cousins, let alone that she had forgotten that she'd had them. Besides, who doesn't sometimes forget birthdays, phone numbers, the names of the grandchildren, or whether or not they've had lunch? Damn chicken shed, Floyd muttered to himself. That's where all the trouble started. Burnt down last month and nearly took the barn with it. The fire crew said the heater had shorted and started the fire. That was hardly his fault. But why'd you have the heater on, Dad? John had asked, as if he were the public prosecutor. Because the chickens will die in winter if they don't have heat. But you don't have chickens anymore, Dad. Course not, Floyd had replied curtly. They all died in the bloody fire. Sometimes Floyd wondered why he bothered trying to explain anything to his son. All those years in that bank job seemed to have turned his brain to jelly. But it didn't matter. Nothing really mattered anymore. Everyone had made up their minds that he couldn't stay on the farm. Fire was just a convenient excuse. Sunny Hills Retirement Home. That's where they wanted to send him. Sunny Hills, my arse, thought Floyd. There's not a hill in sight, and very little sunshine in those little cells they call rooms. He had been there a few times to visit his cousin Henry when his family had put him in. Henry didn't last long after that. Floyd remembered the smells, burnt toast, urine, disinfectants, and the blank stares of people who had given up, people whose families didn't have the time or ability to take care of them. He didn't understand how anyone could do that to family. He'd taken care of Emily for 3 years after her stroke. John and Susan said she should be in a home, but it wasn't their decision. It wasn't easy, but he'd kept her at home where she was happy. In good weather, they went for short walks, and he sat her every day by the window that looked out across the paddocks toward the Great Wood. She was happy and died at home, her own home, on a beautiful spring day. He cried when he thought about Emily, but he tried not to do it when anyone else was around. Since Emily's death, Floyd had been thinking about a lot of things. He had time now. John had organized a woman to come by twice a week to do cleaning and bring him pre-cooked meals that he could warm up later in the microwave. They'd fixed the oven so he couldn't use it anymore, said they didn't trust him to remember to turn it off. And Susan took care of paying bills. That gave Floyd time to remember. Floyd tried to remember the important stuff. Some memories were getting harder to hold on to. It was like trying to grasp on to fish with your bare hands. The harder you squeeze, the faster they slip out of your grip. It bothered him at first, memories slipping away like that. Then he began to forget what it was he was trying to remember. Things didn't seem as bad then. It was like waking up in the morning and remembering that you had had a really good idea in the night when you were half awake, half dreaming, but you can't remember what the idea was, only that it was really brilliant. But because you can't remember what the idea was that you've lost, you don't feel so bad about losing it. That's what Floyd felt like sometimes. He knew there was stuff missing, stuff that used to be important, but it's hard to get upset about it if you can't work out just what it is you've forgotten. It's funny, he thought, the way an old man's memory works. The practical stuff, recent things, seemed so elusive, but the old memories grew clearer as others broke up and drifted away. Perhaps, he thought, that's how the brain makes room for the important things again, once the other stuff isn't needed anymore. Floyd was pleased with this thought. He told himself that someone who had lost their marbles wouldn't be able to come up with ideas like that. Floyd remembered the apple pies his mother made every autumn. He could close his eyes and taste them still. He remembered the first time his father had taken him out on the lake fishing. He remembered when his sister was born and the songs they sang as children at the Sunday school at the little wood-frame church that used to stand down the road. But most of all, he remembered the winter he'd gotten lost in the snow. He was chasing after his dog, Jake, who had run off through the snow into the great wood after a winter hare. It was 82 years ago. Floyd was 5 years old. It had begun to snow and snow hard. He could not find his tracks any longer to follow them back home. And there was no sign of Jake, no sign of the farm. There were only the endless clusters of massive trees in the great wood and snow. Everywhere snow. And of course he remembered the snow mother. At least he thought he did. Afterward, everyone told him he had been delirious, that he had just imagined her. As he grew older, he began to believe them. But 4 days in the great wood in midwinter? That's how long it was before they found him. And he looked like he had just left the house. No one could explain it. Maybe a wolf helped him, some said. There were a few in the great wood, and there were legends about them helping small children. Perhaps he remembered the wolf as his snow mother. Others thought he must have found a small cave, huddled up and slept for 4 days, and dreamed about a snow mother before waking up and wandering out. The memories were coming back now. Floyd remembered those events like they had happened only last week. It was as if his brain had simply ignored the intervening years and had taken a shortcut back to that winter. He remembered being frightened in the snow. He remembered being cold. He was afraid he would die in the snow, like the calf the winter before. Then he remembered not feeling afraid or cold anymore. He simply rested his head in the snow and slept. When he woke up, she was there. It was the snow mother who kept him alive, but no one believed him. No one believes a 5-year-old, or for that matter, he thought, an old man who they say has dementia. Everyone found their own explanation for what had happened. His parents were so happy to have him back that it didn't matter to them how he had survived. When he asked about the snow mother, asked if he could go back to the great wood to visit her, they just smiled and reminded him that he had chores to do. In time, he began to forget about the snow mother. In the winter, he disappeared for 4 days. As an adult, he began to wonder whether he had imagined the whole thing. To his children and grandchildren, it was just a story. There was no one left who could confirm that it really did happen. Maybe he worried it hadn't. Maybe it was just one of those weird memories that gets implanted somehow in your head, like from a movie or something. But then last week, rummaging randomly through layers of family memorabilia, trying to keep his mind connected to his past, to himself, he found a clipping from the local paper. His mother had saved it in an old paper bag along with old birthday and Christmas cards and tucked it away in the bottom of her cedar chest beneath her wedding dress. Floyd stared at the yellowed newspaper clipping. A grainy black and white image of his 5-year-old self stared back at him from across the decades. Above it was the caption, "Local boy found alive in Great Wood after 4 days alone in the snow. Police chief calls it a miracle." And so Floyd knew that there was nothing wrong with his memory. 82 years later, he knew that the snow mother was real. He also knew what he needed to do.